the Immigration Minister, Chris Bowen, joins me now live in our Sydney studio. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Heather.
You've re-embraced the term multiculturalism, but why was it dumped in the first place? Since when was it dead?
Well, Heather, I thought it was particularly important in relation to comments made by Angela Merkel and David Cameron and Nicolas Sarkozy and others about multiculturalism. It appears fashionable around the world to declare multiculturalism as dead. I thought it was important to declare openly and clearly that in Australia, in my view, and the government's view, multiculturalism has worked, and to reassert that, and to point out the differences of approach between Australia and Germany, for example, and I think Malcolm Fraser put those well during your story, to point out that we've had a different approach and a different experience, and that multiculturalism is an important part of who we are and who we want to be, and that we welcome full participation in society from those who've come to us as migrants, and with the underpinning values of respect for rule of law, democracy, freedom, tolerance and sexual equality. I think that's a very important message, and we can forget how important multiculturalism has been. We need to talk about it and remind ourselves what a good thing it's been for Australia.
Had you been running scared of voters in the western suburbs of Sydney and elsewhere? Because there was no mention of multiculturalism when Julia Gillard became Prime Minister. There was no mention of it during the election campaign or in the months leading up to it. Why now?
Well, I don't accept that, Heather. Labor Party's platform has always been clear about support for multiculturalism, and we've always been clear about that.
You weren't talking about it very much.
Well, but I think it's, as I say, Heather, important in response to claims made by other leaders around the world, and which have seeped into Australian discussions as well, about whether multiculturalism strengthens a society or weakens it. We think it strengthens it, and that's an important message to put. Multiculturalism is not a word we should be afraid of, not a word we should run away from, a word we should embrace.
Minister, how was Harmony Day? Because there didn't look to be too much harmony where you were.
Well, look, Harmony Day is an important day, and one of the things we celebrate, as I said in my remarks this morning, is freedom of speech, and some people exercise that, and I think that's good. I think members of Parliament should be subject to that, and we should be. I don't think members of Parliament should be sealed in a vacuum and not exposed to the views of people who we might strongly disagree with, but they should be able to put those views. You
have copped enormous slack, both today at Harmony Day and throughout the week, over your refusal to release a 9-year-old boy from Christmas Island who lost both of his parents, to release them to his family in Sydney. Why the sudden back down tonight?
Well, Heather, I've said all along that I wanted to see this young boy released into the community as soon as possible. And nobody could watch
But you also kept on saying you wouldn't bend the rules.
No, I didn't, Heather. What I said was that I wanted to see him released as soon as possible, but there were some things we had to do first. Now, it's important we go through this, and I'm happy to go through it. You might recall that I've been criticised for bringing the boy to Sydney, for paying for his flight and the flights of the others to come to Sydney to say goodbye to their family members. I don't apologise for that for one second. It was the right thing to do. Now, like every other Australian, I watched that funeral and nobody could help but feel nothing but sympathy and to want that boy to come into the community. But I also thought it was important that he not be separated from those family members who've looked after him on Christmas Island since that tragic accident. I understand the natural reaction of people to say, take him and put him with the relatives in Sydney. I thought it was important not necessarily to do that, but to let him stay with the people who've been looking after him, but to move them all into the community. Now, that takes a little bit longer, but I asked my department to expedite that, to make sure all the checks and necessary consultation with the State Community Services Department, to make sure that that could be done. Now, today, that has happened, and I'm in a position to release
What suddenly changed?
Well, no,
because right up until yesterday, as late as yesterday, you were insisting that you could not bend the rules in a hurry.
Well, Heather, with respect, I was insisting that I wanted to see him in the community. I was pointing out that I would ensure that his case would be prioritised, and that's exactly what I did. Now, I have a duty of care, Heather, to make sure we get it right. It would have been more popular, I accept, for me to say I'm going to remove him from the family on Christmas Island and give him to another family. That's a very big decision, and one I was not prepared to take. I've taken the advice of the people on the ground as to what's in his best interests, and it's important to also note, Heather, he's received a lot of media attention, rightly. There are 2 other young children on Christmas Island who are survivors of that accident who've received nowhere near enough as much attention. I want to see them released.
Will they be released as well?
Yes. Yes, I put them through the
Next
same
week?
process. Yes, I put them through the same process, expedited their consideration, made sure that we have A, accommodation for them, suitable accommodation, B, all the psychological care which goes with their transfer.
Can I just clarify that, Minister, for a moment? Will the 9-year-old boy that we've been talking about, will he be reunited with his family in Sydney, or is he going to be put somewhere else?
He's going to be kept with the family who've been looking after him on Christmas Island, his relatives who've been looking after him on Christmas Island.
And does that satisfy his relatives in Sydney who wanted to keep him with them?
Well, I've obviously not spoken to them about that, but what I have done is ensure that the people who've been looking after him will be able to continue to care for him. And they are his relatives too. And I've made sure that that happens in Sydney so he can keep in contact with all his relatives. Heather, I understand people's strong views about this. With all the information I have available to me, and it's often difficult in individual cases because I can't go into details about people's privacy and all the information I have available to me. But I wanted to make sure he was released as soon as possible, but with all the necessary checks and balances. And yes, that has led to some criticism, just as I was criticised earlier in the week for bringing him to Sydney in the first place. But frankly, I think it's more important to get it right, even though it might mean some criticism along the way.
Can I get this straight? You've allowed a boy to fly to Sydney to attend the funerals, the devastating funeral of his father. You wouldn't let him stay immediately with his family in Sydney. He's now on a flight home to Christmas Island that's stranded, I think, in Port Hedland because of the cyclone. He'll then go to Christmas Island, and then next week you let him go home to Sydney. Now, how can that be good for a boy who's already suffered so much trauma? How could you put him through that?
Well, Heather, as I say, the advice to me has been twofold. Firstly, it's important to keep that group together. The 21 people who came to the funeral, they were told they would go to the funeral together, and they were told they would be taken back to Christmas Island together. It's important we keep our word about that. And secondly, some of those people in that group have expressed a desire, for want of a better word, to go back to the scene of the accident for some closure and look at that one last time. And also, importantly, Heather, to say goodbye to the people they've been living with on Christmas Island for 2 months. Now, I think it's important to allow that. Now, as I say, the advice to me has been up until now that it's in people's best interest to be kept together on Christmas Island. That was always going to change.
Yes, and that's what I wanted to ask you. Who offered that advice? Who was the psychologist, the psychiatrist who gave that advice, and exactly what was the advice? Well,
the Department of Immigration workers on the ground, including the psychological workers, the qualified professionals who spend their time with these people. Now, I understand we all reach our own conclusions about what we see on the television, etc., but with all the advice to me, I've had to make the best judgment calls I can about what was in the best interests of everybody involved. Now, I think, as I've said all along, I've said consistently, I wanted to see him in the community. Who wouldn't? Which human being wouldn't want to see him in the community, Heather? Certainly I did, but it was important that we get it right and that he not be separated from his family members on Christmas Island as part of that process.
Did you make a very big mistake here?
Well, Heather, being Immigration Minister means making controversial decisions. All the criticism of me was that I shouldn't have brought the family to Sydney in the first place. That was the right decision. Some people still are saying that to me today, that you shouldn't have brought them to Sydney. I think that's wrong. Having brought him to Sydney, yes, then we saw him going through a terrible, terrible funeral. And yes, people said release him into the community, and so did I say release him into the community, but I had to get it right. I had to make sure all the necessary checks had been done and all the support and care was in place, and that's what we've done.
Minister, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Heather.